Cornelius Jasper spent 41 years writing things down in a 3-ring binder he kept on the passenger seat of his truck. He wrote down rainfall dates, drainage behavior, soil color after a long wet spell, the names of fields that came back fast after a flood, and the names of fields that didn't. He died in January of 2007, 14 months before his grandson walked into the Hardin County tax sale and raised his hand over 12 acres of drowned apple orchard that every other person in the room had already decided wasn't worth the paper the deed was printed on. Cornelius never saw any of what happened after, but Laverne Okafor, who had been the soil conservationist for the USTA Natural Resources Conservation Service Office in Eldora, Iowa, for 19 years, said later that Cornelius Jasper was the reason any of it happened at all. She said you couldn't tell the story of the land without telling the story of the man who had read it for 4 decades, before anyone else thought to look. She had known Cornelius since 1998. She met him at a drainage workshop she ran out of the extension office on a Thursday evening in March of that year, one of those meetings where you put out folding chairs and hope for 8 people and get 4. Cornelius Jasper had been one of the 4. He sat in the front row. He took notes on a legal pad. He asked 2 questions at the end that she said were better than any questions she'd been asked at a paid seminar. She remembered thinking, this man has been doing this work alone for a long time without anyone to talk to about it. She was right. He had been farming in Hardin County since 1974, on rented ground first and then on 80 acres he'd bought outside Hubbard in 1981. And in 30 years of farming that county he had built exactly one friendship with another farmer, a man named Gene Troutman, who ran Herefords on the road's south side and who died in 2003. Most of the men at the co-op elevator, the men at the implement dealer, the men at the auction barns, and the diner booths where farm business got discussed in Hardin County in those years. They were polite to Cornelius. Some of them were genuinely decent to him. None of them asked his opinion about anything. He was one of very few black farmers in the county, and in the circles where agricultural knowledge moved from man to man over coffee and across fence lines, he was not inside the circle. So, he kept his own records. He watched his own ground and other people's ground, and he wrote it all down. Somebody had to write this story down before it got forgotten. If you believe that matters, take a second to subscribe before we go further. The rest of it is worth your time. The Hardin County tax sale on the second Tuesday of April 2008 was held in the basement of the courthouse in Eldora, Iowa, at 9 in the morning. There were 16 parcels on the list. The last one was 12 acres in the river bottom of Union Township, former apple orchard, assessed at $180 an acre on paper and worth considerably less in practice because it had been underwater for the better part of 4 consecutive years. The drainage tile that Harold Vetter had laid in the late 1970s, clay laterals on 80-foot spacing, running to a 12-inch header at the northeast corner, had been failing since about 2004. One collapsed section near the outlet backing up the entire system, the water table rising behind it the way water will when you give it no exit. By 2007, you couldn't get a tractor on 8 of the 12 acres from April through July. Harold Vetter had been dead since 2002. His heirs had not paid taxes on the property since 2005. The county was tired of waiting. 14 people were in the room. 12 of them were white men between the ages of 40 and 70. One was Diane Scholl, the county clerk running the sale from behind a folding table. One was Marcus Jasper, who was 17 years old and the grandson of Cornelius Jasper, and who was the only person in that room under 30, and the only black person in it. He sat in the second row, not the back. He wore a clean button-down shirt. He had $15 in cash in an envelope and a folded sheet of paper in his chest pocket that had come from his grandfather's binder. When Diane Scholl opened the bidding on the orchard parcel, she read the description the same way she'd read the 15 before it. Parcel number, acreage, back taxes owed, condition noted as drainage impaired, not suitable for row crop production in current state. She set the opening bid at $15. She looked up. Marcus raised his hand. She looked at him. She looked at the room. The room looked back at him. The way rooms look at something they have already concluded is not their business. Not hostile. Not curious. Just done with the subject before it started. A man named Roy Patton, who farmed corn and beans on 600 acres east of Hubbard and had sat through all 16 parcels that morning, nursing a styrofoam cup of coffee, told Laverne Okafor about it 2 years later. He said he remembered the boy raising his hand, and he remembered thinking the boy must have been lost, or there on a dare, or doing something for a school project. It didn't occur to him, he said, that the boy knew something. He said he wasn't proud of that. He said it plainly, the way honest people admit things when they've had time to sit with them. Nobody else bid. Diane Scholl marked the sheet. Marcus Jasper bought 12 acres of drowned orchard in the river bottom of Union Township, Hardin County, Iowa, for $15. Plus $219. No dollars in assumed back taxes. $234 total. He was 17. He drove himself home. He was not supposed to be driving. His mother found out about this part later and had a separate conversation with him about it that had nothing to do with the land. Laverne Okafor heard about the sale 3 weeks after it happened. She heard it from Gene Troutman's widow, Martha, who still lived on the Hereford operation east of town, and who had been one of the few neighbors to maintain a friendship with Cornelius Jasper after Gene died. Martha called Laverne's office and said a boy had bought the Vetter orchard at the tax sale, and she thought Laverne ought to know, because the boy was Cornelius's grandson, and Laverne had known Cornelius, and the land involved had a drainage situation that the boy might benefit from talking through with someone professional. Laverne drove out the following Saturday. She found Marcus Jasper already in the field. He was in rubber boots, carrying a piece of half-inch rebar, probing the ground in a grid pattern that she recognized immediately. He had the folded sheet from his grandfather's binder in one hand, a hand-drawn drainage map she could see, with tile runs marked in pencil, depths noted in a cramped handwriting she would later recognize as Cornelius's. He was matching the map to the ground. He had already located 3 of the 5 lateral runs. He had marked them with small flags made from survey tape and sticks. She stood at the fence line and watched him for a few minutes before he saw her. She said later she almost didn't interrupt. She said there was something about watching a 17-year-old boy alone in a flooded field with a rebar and a dead man's map, working steadily and without any apparent hurry, that made her want to be careful about how she entered the picture. He looked up. She introduced herself. She told him she had known his grandfather. He said he knew. He said his grandfather had mentioned her. She asked him what he was looking for, and he told her. The outlet section. The collapsed header. The point where the system had failed. He showed her the map. She looked at it for a long time. Cornelius had drawn it from a conversation with Harold Vetter in the late 1980s, she guessed, based on the detail. He had noted the tile depth, the header diameter, the outlet elevation above the county ditch. He had noted the spacing in feet and the material, clay, not plastic, and he had written one sentence at the bottom of the page in the same cramped hand: bottom ground with sound tile will grow corn. The tile is the question. She asked Marcus if he had found the outlet yet. He said not yet, but he thought it was within 30 feet of the northeast corner, based on the grade. She said that was right, and that she had the original drainage permit on file in her office from when Vetter had put the system in. If he wanted the exact location, he said he would. She drove back to Eldora that afternoon and pulled the permit from a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in 11 years. The outlet was 22 feet from the corner. The permit showed the installed depth and grade. She made a copy and mailed it to his house. What Cornelius Jasper had understood and written down and passed to his grandson in a binder that the rest of his estate mostly overlooked was a thing that Laverne Okafor had spent 19 years trying to get farmers in that county to understand at drainage workshops that 4 people attended. Flooded bottomland in central Iowa is not, in most cases, permanently flooded. It is temporarily flooded because a piece of infrastructure has failed. The water table in the river bottoms of Hardin County will drop on its own given a functioning outlet. The soil underneath, heavy clay, high in organic matter built up from decades of root decay and plant material, is some of the most productive ground in the county when it drains. The question is never the soil. The question is always the tile. Most people who looked at the 12 acres on Union Township Road saw the water. Cornelius Jasper, when he had walked that ground with Harold Vetter in the 1980s, had looked at the water and thought about where it would go if you opened a door for it. He had written that down too, not in so many words. But Laverne read the binder later, after Marcus brought it to her, and she said the logic was clear on every page. Cornelius thought in systems. He thought about what moved water, what held it, what happened to soil when water sat on it for 1 year versus 4. He had developed this habit in the 1970s, she thought, partly out of necessity. When you are farming alone, without the informal network of neighbors who share what they know at the co-op counter and the elevator scale house and the implement dealer's waiting room, when that network is not available to you for reasons that have nothing to do with what you know, you build your own. You watch. You write things down. You keep the binder on the passenger seat. Marcus found the collapsed section on his 3rd day of probing. A 12-inch clay header, 31 feet from the northeast corner, had dropped 4 inches below grade. Not broken through, just settled, the way old clay tile settles when the bedding beneath it shifts over 30 years. 4 inches of drop in 31 feet was enough to stop the flow entirely. Everything behind it was backed up. He called Laverne to tell her. She asked if he had a plan for the repair. He said he thought he did. He had a neighbor, a retired farmer named Douglas Petrie, who had been renting the field across the road from the Jasper 80 acres since before Marcus was born, and who had known Cornelius for 30 years. Douglas Petrie had a Caterpillar 4-1 Scene backhoe that he ran slowly and carefully and maintained the way some men maintain clocks. He told Marcus he would help with the dig. He did not ask for payment. He said Cornelius had pulled his truck out of a ditch for him in the winter of 1993 and had never mentioned it again, and he had been looking for a way to close that account for 15 years. They worked 4 weekends in May and early June of 2008. They dug out the collapsed section, recut the grade with a transit level that Douglas kept in a wooden box in his shop, relined the connection with 6-inch perforated plastic pipe bedded in pea gravel, and retied the outlet to the county ditch with a rubber coupling and concrete collar. The repair cost $290 in materials. It cost nothing in labor. Laverne drove out on the last weekend and looked at the outlet work. She said it was done right. She said Cornelius would have said the same thing. The water started dropping in the 2nd week of June. 3 inches in the first 8 days, then slower, a steady inch every 4 days through the rest of the month. Marcus had put 30 khaki Campbell ducks on the flooded ground in early May because the flooded acreage was exceptional for them, and because he had read about duck enterprises in a 1994 copy of Small Farm Journal he found in his grandfather's barn, tucked into the binder box. He sold eggs through his mother's friend, who ran a small grocery in Ackley, Iowa, 7 miles east. $60 a week, give or take. In the third week of June, the ducks went quiet. They had been loud from first light every morning, that particular sustained racket of khaki Campbells on open water, and one morning they weren't. Marcus walked the field that evening and found them on a dry ridge near the east fence line, lined up in the low sun. Sleeping, he pressed his boot into the ground next to them. Firm, he pushed the rebar in, dry at 16 inches. He stood there for a while. He didn't know what the ducks knew or whether they knew anything. He isn't sure now, and he said so plainly when he talked about it later. What he knew was that the ground beneath them was dry, and that dry ground in that field, in that month, meant the repair had worked. He moved the ducks to a pond on Douglas Petrie's property 3 days later. He didn't need them on the field anymore. The field was ready. He seeded winter wheat in September of 2008, $197 in seed, planted with a John Deere 450 grain drill he borrowed from Douglas Petrie for the cost of a tank of diesel. The wheat came up well. He sold it the following July to the co-op elevator in Eldora for $4, 41 a bushel. The drained acres yielded 54, 8 bushels per acre. Not a record for the county, but a real number from ground that had been underwater 18 months earlier. The check was for $322. He had spent $234 on the land, $290 on materials, $197 on seed, and roughly $65 in diesel and incidentals. His total investment was $786. His first year's net was $536. He planted corn the year after. Then soybeans. He kept a notebook, red-spine composition book, same as his grandfather's, from the same drugstore in Eldora because they still stocked them. He noted yield by field zone. He noted drainage behavior after heavy rains. He noted which low corners stayed wet longest and why. Laverne Okafor saw the notebook when she visited the farm in 2011, by which point Marcus had added 2 more rented parcels and was running 280 acres total. She said the handwriting was different from Cornelius's, but the thinking wasn't. People in Union Township started asking questions around 2010. Not many. But Roy Patton, the man who had been in the tax sale room with his styrofoam coffee and his quiet assumptions, drove past the cornfield one afternoon in July and stopped his truck on the road's shoulder for a while. He called the NERC's office in Eldora and asked who farmed the old Vetter ground. Laverne told him. He was quiet for a moment. He said he'd been at the sale in 2008. She said she knew. He asked if the boy would take a phone call. She said she'd ask. He said he wanted to talk about drainage. She said that was a good place to start. Marcus Jasper is 33 years old now. He farms 410 acres in Hardin County, roughly 60 of them owned, the rest rented. The original 12 acres are still in his name. He expanded the tile system in 2013. New plastic laterals on 60-foot spacing across the sections that still showed wet spots in early spring. The old clay tile mapped and left in place where it held. The soil tests from that year came back high in organic matter, which the ANARC's report attributed to the years of anaerobic decomposition during the flooded period. It was, in other words, more productive ground for having been drowned. Cornelius would have found that satisfying. He had written something close to it in the binder. Not about that specific parcel. About bottomland in general. He had written it in the 1990s, when he had no particular reason to write it except that it was true, and he had seen it, and he did not like to let true things go unwritten. Douglas Petrie sold his operation in 2016 and moved to be near his daughter in Cedar Rapids. He and Marcus had coffee the week before he left. What they said to each other Marcus has kept to himself, which seems right. Laverne Okafor retired in 2019. She still lives in Eldora. She still has a copy of the drainage permit from Harold Vedder's 1979 tile installation, the one she mailed to Marcus in 2008. She made an extra copy before she retired and gave it to him. He has it in a file. He also has the binder. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not travel easily between people, not because it is complicated, but because the paths it travels along are built out of trust, and trust has to be made, and making it takes time and openness that not every room affords to every person in it. Cornelius Jasper spent 30 years farming good ground in Hardin County and building his knowledge in a binder on a truck seat, because the rooms where that knowledge usually moved were not rooms he was easily let into. He was patient about this, not resigned. Patient, there is a difference, and he knew it. He passed what he had to the boy who would read it, and the boy who would read it walked into a room at 17 and raised his hand over 12 acres of water, while 12 men with 30 years on him looked away. The ground gave back what the tile had kept from it. The ducks knew before the rebar did, and the notebook is still on the farm, in a drawer in the office of a man who learned to keep one from a man he never got to farm beside long enough. Some things take longer than they should. They still get there.